Thank you, Craig. If you guys don't know, about 2 years ago, Craig hired me, and so he gave me a job, and I wouldn't be here without him. He has the vision for this conference. He's really the one that brought all of this together. Nobody else would have thought, oh, like exercise and poetry and all this other stuff is going to mesh so well and make this great conference. That's all him. I want to thank you guys, too, for coming. And I hope that you're having a really great time and you're already planning on joining us again next year and bringing your friends and your family, telling them what a great time you had. I also want to thank our atlases and our donors. Without them, neither this conference nor TOS could be. So you guys make this possible. And I want to thank those who joined me for the breakout session last night. Craig was just talking about journalistic portraits. If you want another example of one of those, today is the 110th birthday of one of my heroes, Leo Fender, the inventor of the electric bass. If you're interested in learning a little bit about Fender, I just published an article on him this morning, so go to the Objective Standard and check it out. All right, so Jon Locke. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about Jon Locke. I got interested in Locke when about 6 months ago, Craig and I had a conversation, and he told me that I had to give this talk today. Just kidding, no. I was reading Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson referred to him as one of the three greatest men the world had ever produced, along with Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon. That's extraordinary praise. And then I was reading Benjamin Franklin and his plan for the Philadelphia Academy, which we know today as the University of Pennsylvania. And in just about every subject he talked about in his plan for the Philadelphia Academy, he referenced Jon Locke at length. And then I was reading Brad Thompson's excellent book on John Adams, and he made it very clear that Locke had a huge role in John Adams's intellectual development, in his revolution principles, and just in his method of thinking. So it was like this network of amazing people. And it doesn't matter what node you tap into, they all come back to this center, and that is Jon Locke. It's kind of like, remember those plastic discs we used to use to listen to music? I think Andy Bernstein said that there were CDs or something. Have you ever had that experience where you take out the liner notes for several of your favorite albums, and you start to see the same name repeatedly? It's like the same engineer or the same producer. And you have that realization, like, oh, that's the special sauce. That's the guy behind the guys. Or maybe if you're like Patrick, you're into movies, it's like the LD or something. Well, that's Jon Locke. He's the guy behind the guys. He's the hero behind so many American heroes. His dates were 1632 to 1704. And he was at the forefront of Enlightenment thinkers that supported a rational, scientific, this-worldly approach to knowledge. You've probably heard it said that the history of the West is a battle between the followers of Plato and those of Aristotle, between the mystical and the rational, between the otherworldly and the this-worldly. Well, the Enlightenment, as we were hearing from Sandifer before lunch, can you believe that Craig lets me edit the guy's writing? He's amazing. The Enlightenment was a period when Aristotle's influence prevailed, when many men, for the first time since ancient Greece, truly prized their minds as the lights by which they could understand and shape the world around them. Isaac Newton discovered the mathematical principles that govern physical phenomena. Benjamin Franklin turned electricity into a science. This is my shameless attempt to get my dogs into this presentation. Denis Diderot organized a mass of new knowledge into the world's first encyclopedia. Andy Bernstein first began teaching philosophy. That's why he's so good at it. Lots of practice. Instead of basking in the thoughts of the glory of some afterlife, a great number of men turned their focus to the here and now, to making this life as good as possible for humans. And among them were some who took that scientific bent of mind and turned it on man himself, on his capacity for knowledge, on ethics, and on the proper purpose and structure of government. And the result of that effort was most eloquently expressed in the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," wrote Jefferson. "They have certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." In one word, the distinctive social and political philosophy of the Enlightenment was liberty. And so the system of ideas developed to support and defend it became known as liberalism. Not the stuff that AOC and company today are promoting. We'll talk about the split in that term's meaning a little later. Jefferson made it clear that the object of the Declaration was not to find out new arguments never before thought of, but rather to be an expression of the American mind. He conceded that all its weight rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day. And he readily acknowledged that those harmonizing sentiments were, in large part, put forth by John Locke. Indeed, if Jefferson or any other thinker at the time had attempted to express the Western mind or the Enlightenment mind as such, he'd be hard-pressed to articulate its harmonizing sentiments without invoking the ideas of John Locke. Locke so well encapsulated the Enlightenment because he passionately pursued any and all knowledge that could be used to enhance human life and happiness. He was first a student at Oxford, where he met the greatest chemist of his day, Robert Boyle. And together the two conducted experiments, not the kind they do on college campuses nowadays. "Hey guys, let's see how much we can drink and still walk." They were interested in things like, what is blood? What does blood do? What's its function? What about air? What is the nature of the air? In fact, Locke speculated that there was a causal connection between air temperature and weather patterns on the one hand, and the spread of disease on the other. And he tracked air temperature and weather throughout much of his life, hoping that other people around the world would do the same, and that someday scientists would come along and integrate this data into a causal theory of the spread of disease. Medicine, we don't really know this, we don't think of Locke as a doctor, but medicine was actually his driving passion in life. It's kind of cool. He said that life free from infirmity and pain is of such great concernment to mankind that there can scarce be a better profession than the curing of diseases. He was mentored by the opinionated English physician Thomas Sydenham, who became known as the English Hippocrates, and his work, Observations Medicae, became a principal text for medical students for 2 centuries. So this guy really knew his stuff. But to steal a phrase from Alex Epstein, Locke was a student of life. He was fascinated with all useful knowledge. He befriended Isaac Newton after publishing a review of his Principia Mathematica in a Dutch journal. And when he traveled to France in the company of a diplomat, he didn't just take notes on their mission there. He actually took notes on everything from harvesting sea salt to winemaking and everything in between, whatever that means. He took such voluminous notes throughout his life that at some point he was forced to create his own method for indexing them, and sort of like his own primitive version of Google allowed him to quickly get back to things he'd previously written on any topic. When a friend in France actually published Locke's method, he said it brought him more friends than anything else he'd ever published. Locke, his depth and breadth of knowledge was amazing. A friend said that he was a rare breed, a homo versatilis ingeni, a man of versatile mind and fit for whatever he would undertake. To achieve such depth and breadth of thought, Locke held one principle supreme: the need for complete intellectual honesty. He repeatedly stressed that we have to follow the truth wherever it leads, that it makes no sense to dig in one's heels to try to save face on an argument. It's much better by far to admit when one is wrong, and to learn from others. If the point is useful knowledge, then there's just no point in trying to save face. He never exempted his own thoughts from this. In fact, he often invited frank criticism. He wrote to, a Dublin savant, William Molyneux, wrote to him with some mild feedback on his essay concerning human understanding, his landmark work in philosophy. And Locke, he responded, he said, "Deal freely in your feedback. I flatter myself that I'm so sincere a lover of truth that I value any parcel of this gold not the less because I was not the one who brought it up out of the mine." He often likened solitary reflection to digging in the mine. And he said that what we bring up has to be tested against the light of reason. It has to be tested against the knowledge of a knowing and judicious friend. Indeed, even the title of his landmark work in philosophy, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, reflects his deep concern for intellectual honesty. Today, we use the word essay to mean just about any piece of nonfiction writing. In Locke's day, it had a very, very specific meaning. It was something like a hypothesis. It was the author's attempt at clarification on a topic, but it was not his supposition of a final settled view, or even his fully considered opinion. Locke emphasized intellectual honesty, perhaps in part because of the intellectual climate of his day. Christian Aristotelians, known as scholastics, had largely adopted the conclusions of Aristotle, but they repudiated his observation-based method, which put them in the bizarre position, often of supporting truths as if they were dogma. Once while Locke was on a trip abroad, he was accosted by some young monks who argued for Aristotle's notion of prime matter, the idea that there can be substance that has no form and thus can become anything. They had no evidence to point to. They had no life-serving use in their context. But they argued for it, Locke said, as if they intended to make their dinner on it. He just didn't really understand this type of philosophic debate. He thought it was artificial ignorance, he said, learned gibberish. Descartes, for instance, well, let's back up. So he applauded the fact that more and more intellectuals were adopting the experimental natural philosophy, the scientific method. They were proceeding on the basis of observation and experiment. But still, much of the intellectual world was dominated by scholastics and by speculative natural philosophers, those who started with abstract maxims and attempted to deduce various conclusions from them. Descartes had spun from thin air his famous vortex theory, which held that the celestial bodies move in a massive network of whirling fluid. Thomas Burnet, in order to explain the biblical flood, even though there's not enough water in the Earth's atmosphere, said that the Earth was like an egg. Its shell cracked and fell into the water below. So Locke thought this was babble, which, having no relation to the nature of things, is fit for nothing at bottom, but to waste men's time in inventing or comprehending it. And he was starting to realize that there was a problem. He was coming to the conclusion that there was one thing that was really stultifying human progress and holding men back. And that problem sort of crystallized in his mind in 1671 when he threw this great party that I think everyone here could really appreciate. He invited some friends over to discuss the roots of morality. And they were soon confounded, he said, by questions on all sides. Before they could really figure out what it means to be moral, they had to figure out what it means to know anything. What does it mean to have knowledge? He later reflected that men have so various and wholly contradictory opinions that we might think that there's no such thing as truth or that we have no means of knowing it. And he set out to solve this problem. So he put some thoughts together for discussion among his friends back in 1671. And then over the next 18 years, in fits and starts, he wrote and edited and wrote. And finally, in 1689, he published his landmark work in philosophy, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding. The generation before Locke, Descartes had revived Plato's idea that we are born with innate ideas, that we have ideas that are inscribed in our minds by our Creator. And that what we ought to do is shut ourselves off from the evidence of experience and merely consult these so-called innate ideas. Well, to Locke, who was conducting experiments with Robert Boyle, who was performing life-saving surgery, who was corresponding with scientists on the cutting edge from all over the world, nothing could have been more nonsensical than the idea that we have to shut ourselves off from the evidence of experience and merely consult these so-called innate ideas. He said that if there were any such thing, they'd have to be universally known and universally accepted. I know someone in here is dying to ask if there's a connection between John Locke and the character by that name from the great show, Lost. This guy in Lost fantasized about going on walkabouts, but he had no use of his legs until he landed on this island. Well, the connection here is that John Locke loved the accounts of explorers. He often traveled himself, but not to distant lands and faraway places. But he read the accounts of those he did. He had a huge collection of travel literature. He loved the accounts of explorers who'd met people of exotic cultures. And so he could easily draw on this knowledge to point out that even the most uncontroversial ideas that could be supposed in support of his theory of innate ideas were not even known, never mind accepted, by large portions of the world's population. Not only that, but the children and mentally handicapped there in England didn't know them. Moreover, he said, if there were any ideas that were universally accepted, that wouldn't prove that they were innate either. It could merely be that they were so obvious that no one could fail to grasp and accept them. He said that at birth, the mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, a white sheet of paper, and the only thing that writes on it is the evidence of experience. All our ideas, everything we ever come to learn, comes from the evidence of experience. Of course, once we have a storehouse of ideas, we can consider those ideas. We can tease out their implications and come to new conclusions. We can even put our ideas together in new combinations of things we've never actually experienced. We've seen breakdancers, we've seen Craig Biddle. As much as we'd like to, we've never seen Craig breakdance, but we can imagine it because we've seen these things. There's much more to say about Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Thankfully, he wrote in such a clear and concise style that I think anyone in here could pick it up and really enjoy it. If you want a more narrow treatment, check out my article in the forthcoming issue of the Objective Standard. In essence, though, it defended a rational, this-worldly approach to knowledge, the Aristotelian approach. And although it wasn't perfect, Locke made admirable strides over the thinkers prior to him. In his thinking about man's mind, he came to another epistemological principle that would have profound political implications. You've probably heard it said that if you're not a liberal by 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by 40, you have no brain. Well, if that's true, Locke was both heartless and brainless. Or at least he broke the mold. He grew up in an England riven by religious conflict. Between the time he was 10 and the time he was 29, England fought 3 civil wars, executed a monarch, exiled another one, established a commonwealth, replaced it with a protectorate, and then reestablished the monarchy. It's kind of a roundabout way to get to monarchy. But it led Locke to the conclusion that people of different religious persuasions are completely incapable of living amongst each other. They just can't do it. What they need is a strong man to impose religious conformity. And when they come into society, they agree to give up their liberty, to give it over to the magistrate, and that the magistrate has complete authority in all things civil and religious. So Locke was understandably awestruck when about 5 years after he put these thoughts down, which, by the way, they were published in the 2 tracts on government, but thankfully not until 1967. So none of this stuff was known by his contemporaries, or of course by later thinkers until the 60s. But he was understandably awestruck when about 5 years after he put this stuff down, he traveled to Cleves in Germany, where Calvinists, Lutherans, and even Catholics lived amongst each other, worshiped peacefully amongst each other, worked together, traded. They weren't cutting each other's heads off. It was a live and let live kind of place. And Locke realized that the strife back in England was not caused by the fact that people of different religious persuasions were living together. It was caused by the fact that some people were trying to force their ideas down the throats of other people. Locke came to realize that no religious belief, nor any type of belief, can be propagated by the force of arms. Such is the nature of the understanding, he said, that no sort of force can get an idea into someone's mind. It just doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work when it comes to religion. He said that we can be cured by a medical remedy that we have no faith in, but we certainly can't be saved by a religion that we have no faith in. So what's the point of forcing it on people? He said that the political authority, the magistrate, he has the authority, of course, to punish those who violate people's rights. But he has no authority when it comes to the salvation of souls. Nor should churchmen go to the magistrate for his help in persuading people that theirs is the right way to heaven. He said that the nature of the human mind requires an absolute separation between church and state. We have to grant Locke his context, however. He lived at a time when the Catholic Church arrogated to itself the authority to demand the deaths of dissenters, much like Islamists do today. He thought that Catholics had too bad a reputation for intolerance to themselves be tolerated. He also thought that atheists, because they didn't believe in God, they had no moral compass, and so would inevitably go astray, and so they don't deserve religious toleration either. Thankfully, Jefferson truly understood Locke's church-state separation principle. He understood that it left government ample means to deal with aggressors, whether Catholic, atheist, or otherwise. And that became the basis for his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which in turn became the basis for the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. Locke would continue to develop his liberal view of government, his idea of government with limits imposed by the nature of man in his mind, and it would continue to bring him into conflict with his contemporaries. In 1679, James II, a Catholic, was poised to inherit the Catholic throne. The English throne. And James II was a Catholic. And his wife had recently become pregnant, which raised the very material possibility of a Catholic dynasty in England. They could look across the channel into France and see that Louis XIV had consolidated power, proclaiming "L'État c'est moi," the state is me. In an effort to preserve parliamentary power in England, Locke's good friend, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, led the Whig Party in an attempt to exclude James II or any Catholic from acceding to the English throne. And it was during this exclusion crisis that Locke furiously penned his 2 treatises on government. But they weren't to be published for another 10 years. Shortly after, some of Shaftesbury's friends were arrested, and they claimed that Shaftesbury was attempting to overthrow the monarchy. He was soon forced to flee to Amsterdam, where he fell ill and died. Shortly after that, one of Locke's contemporaries, Algernon Sidney. Sidney had written ideas very similar to those in Locke's hidden manuscripts for the 2 treatises of government. Sidney was arrested and executed. He saw the writing on the wall, and he found it prudent to flee. He went to Holland, where he'd spend the next several years. And it was not until 1689 that he would come back to England and publish his 2 treatises of government. If you recall, that was the year that he also published his essay concerning human understanding. So if his return ship from Holland to England had gone down, we would never know who Locke was. The 2 treatises were in part an answer to 2 prior thinkers who had attempted to justify absolutism in government. The first was Robert Filmer. Filmer deduced from the Bible an argument for absolute monarchy. He said that God gave Adam absolute dominion over Eve and their children, that his eldest heir inherited this dominion, that in time one of them was made a king, and then various events described in the Bible caused kingdoms to split, thus the proliferation of monarchs by Filmer's day. He also said that, if you don't like that argument, just to cover his bases, he said that any sitting monarch is a legitimate monarch, regardless. So Locke had a great deal of fun tearing apart Filmer's shoddy logic in the first treatise of government. The entire thing is a refutation of Filmer. The second thinker that Locke aimed to refute was Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was far less antiquated in his thinking than Filmer. He thought, like Locke, that political relations derive from man's nature and from the nature of the world. But he held that man, by his nature, in a state of nature, in a pre-political society, is essentially a wild beast. That it's in every man's self-interest to rob and, if necessary, kill others. That the strongest dominate the weak and allow them to live only if they obey his every command. In essence, he argued that might equals right. And he argued that, in fact, this actually benefits people. He said that we're better off under a dictator than we are in a state of anarchy because there's less bloodshed. Locke didn't deny that this was, in fact, how people had treated one another. But he thought it was an altogether different question how they ought to treat one another. He said that we're not wild beasts, we're reasonable beings, and our rational faculty leads us to the discovery of a law of nature, which tells us that despite differences in just about every aspect, intelligence, moral fortitude, strength, some of us can tell poetry and make other people cry, can't all do that. Despite these differences, we're all fundamentally equal in one central respect. We all have an equal right to our own minds, to our own lives, to our own bodies. And we ought to be able to conduct our lives however we see fit, so long as we don't infringe the equal rights of others. So, by extension, Locke said that man has a product of because he owns his body, he owns his blood, sweat, and tears, he owns what that produces. You can legitimately trade your effort for a paycheck, but no one can rightfully take your effort. No one can rightfully take the product of your effort without paying you. If you mix your labor with the land, whether to cultivate crops or to build a house, that becomes your property by right. The root of property rights, he thought, was man's right to his own life. Indeed, he held that all rights derive from man's right to his own life. But, says Locke, in a state of nature, when each man is his own judge, jury, and executioner, life is filled with, as he quaintly put it, inconveniences. Of course, it's more than inconvenient if you're outmatched and incapable of defending yourself against an aggressor, a problem that anarchists simply invite. So if we don't have this protection, we have to go toe-to-toe with our aggressors and just hope that we come out on top. And inevitably, there are great disparities in justice, great disparities in outcomes and punishments. So to better protect their rights, men delegate the retaliatory use of force and the consideration of just penalties to a man or body of men. They give government that job. Locke construed government not as some overlord, but as a service. Government by the consent of the governed. And he said that When the government strays from this purpose, when it abuses our rights, when it infringes the very rights it's supposed to protect, we have every right to rescind our consent, to abolish that government, to return to a state of nature, or to establish a new government. So we can see that though he died 72 years before the Revolutionary War, Locke was, in a very fundamental sense, an American founder. He helped to lay the foundation for freedom. And we heard a lot this morning about the flourishing that freedom unleashed. Oxford economist Max Roser has pointed out that the poorest people in the world today have a much higher life expectancy than even the richest in 1800, and that's about 100 years after Locke. We work way less than people even just a few generations back, but we are far more productive, thanks to advertising, right, Tim? We have all this free time, and we have way more to do with it. I went on a jog before coming to do this talk. Can you imagine a yeoman farmer going on a jog just to burn some calories and have some fun? That was not an option. We are way more mobile than any generation in history. I'd presume that most of us flew here on planes that weigh hundreds of thousands of pounds and fly at hundreds of miles through the air with extreme safety. It's amazing. Our world is simply amazing. Tim Chermak's grandfather downloaded an app that tells him when his steak is ready. Medium rare. Well, that's ready, right? When Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers turned that scientific bent of mind on man himself and discovered the principle of individual liberty, they hit upon the wellspring of human flourishing. To borrow Neil Armstrong's sentiment, they took one giant leap for mankind. Yet Enlightenment ideals, including liberalism, have been under attack since their inception, and they're still under attack today. Rousseau, he's going to get beat up a lot in this conference. Rousseau in 1750, after a half century of evidence in favor of Enlightenment ideals, was awarded a prize for attacking the Enlightenment. He said that to the extent we perfect our arts and our sciences, we denigrate our moral character. And then in 2018, after 2.5 more centuries of evidence in favor of Enlightenment ideals, Patrick Deneen, University of Notre Dame political science professor, published this book, Why Liberalism Failed. He argued that liberalism replaces religious custom with law, that over time, as religious customs are eroded, we need more and more laws to keep people in check. Thus, he says, baked into the fabric of liberalism is its downfall. Here's a guy, by the way, who's presumably sitting in the air conditioning of his office, typing away at his laptop, which to him is pure witchcraft, telling us that liberalism failed. Talk about biting the hand that feeds you. His solution? Well, just as Rousseau glorified the noble savage and advocated a back-to-nature movement, Deneen says we should give up our cities, give up our Amazon Prime, move to the country, start these small, preferably religious farming settlements, and teach our kids the joys of handicraft. I wonder if they were planning on building computers out there. Well, he could not be more wrong about the cause, but he is right about the effect, right? The foundations for freedom are being eroded. But all of liberalism's criticisms come from one fundamental problem. Take Locke's law of nature. He says it's by the discovery of the law of nature that we come to know that other people have equal rights that we must respect. But he doesn't tell us how we get there. He says that the law of nature is something that we're given by God and that we discover it by reason, but he doesn't tell us how. And that leaves both the law itself and its implications for our conduct open to interpretation. Within a decade of Locke's death, this guy, Bishop Berkeley, an Irish bishop, published a book called Passive Obedience, in which he argued that the law of nature demands blind obedience to our magistrates. The obedience that we owe Christ we owe our leaders. He said that this is true even if they are clearly in the wrong. Fast forward to the early 20th century, progressives put serious pressure on the idea that we are endowed with rights by a creator. They were high on this theory of evolution, this new thing. And they said that it undercuts the Bible, right? God-given rights must go with it. In 1935, John Dewey, another progressive spokesman, he referenced Jeremy Bentham, who said that rights are nonsense upon stilts. He said that natural rights and natural liberties belong in the kingdom of mythological social zoology. He said that liberals have come to understand that achieving the aims of liberalism requires a complete reversal of course. We have to completely change what we're doing. What we need to achieve the aims of liberalism is organized social planning. He opened a breach between this idea of classical liberalism, this system of ideas promoted to defend individual rights, and what we now have to call, for sake of clarity, progressive liberalism, if we call it anything, progressivism. But the progressives had their version of liberalism, and we see that effect today. That term, when we hear it, doesn't have a great connotation, right? That's the reason. Well, I'd argue we shouldn't give up the term. We should take it back. If we want to secure a future for freedom and flourishing, we have to be able to say on clear, fully rational grounds what rights are, where they come from, and how we know it. Nonetheless, the fact that we can even see this problem and address it is a testament to John Locke, to the achievements of Locke. We couldn't be having this conversation today if we were in North Korea or Iran, countries largely based on ideas that Locke spent most of his life refuting. He was so effective against tyranny, not only because of his theory of natural rights. Locke was not the first person to promote a theory of natural rights. He was one of the clearest and most comprehensive, and that's probably why he became the most influential. But I'd say that there's a deeper reason. Locke undercut the epistemology of totalitarianism. Plato's idea that we are capable of having these innate ideas necessarily implies the need for elites to sit in solitude, to tease out the implications of these ideas and to get to truth, and that they have some sort of monopoly on the truth. The common man, wrapped up in everyday life, he just has to deal with the mere evidence of the senses. By leveraging an essentially Aristotelian approach, Locke showed that Plato's philosopher king has no clothes. We all have direct access to knowledge. And because of that, we should be able to conduct our lives as we see fit. We still live in the freest, most moral country on earth, and in gratitude and justice for inspiration and instruction, we ought to recall from time to time that those who built it and those who defend it stand on the shoulders of John Locke. Thank you. Hey, Nick.
Hey, can you give the objectivist theory on how we know we have rights?
No.
All right, then.
Go read TOE. I'd love to talk about it afterward. There are obviously some big differences. If you check out my forthcoming essay in TOS, I actually highlight several things that I had no idea that Locke had discovered that I thought Rand had. And it's really amazing. Obviously, Rand had huge innovations over and above Locke, but Locke, it's pretty fascinating. He thought that we create our concepts. He had a very similar idea of concept formation. He thought that we experience many things and we abstract the differences from those things. And it is by abstracting, taking away those differences that we come to more general concepts. So I thought that was really fascinating that Locke had discovered that. There's a bit more too, but you should definitely check out my forthcoming essay. I'm a capitalist, what can I say? Go buy TOS.
On the epistemology, when I first learned history of philosophy, I sort of learned Locke, Berkeley, Hume as like three empiricists I just thought of them as like points on a line.
Yeah.
And all in the same tradition. And from what you're talking about here, it really sounds like Locke and Berkeley at least maybe had very different motivations or goals or approach, kind of where they were coming from and where they wanted to go.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a bit, contrast?
I can, yeah. Thanks for asking. Berkeley came to the conclusion that Locke had this idea, and it was a really bad idea that he accepted from Descartes. And unfortunately, he just went with it. And it was that we don't actually perceive reality. What we perceive are our ideas of reality. And that raises the obvious question, how do we know that our ideas are anything like reality? In order to know that two things are similar, we have to be able to perceive them both, right? But if we can't, well, we're completely cut off from reality. Well, why then do we suppose there's a reality at all? And that's the question that Berkeley asked. Why don't we just live in a universe similar to that of the Matrix? And he thought we did. Locke had thought of this, and his answer was, oh, well, nobody can be so skeptical. But Berkeley was. And Berkeley said that all of our ideas are caused directly in our minds by our creator. There's no physical world. So Berkeley published these thoughts about 8 years after Locke's death, and then became the reigning empiricist. So that's pretty sad. Less than a decade after Locke dies, the reigning empiricist believes that there's no such thing as the physical world. So from that, he's also a Christian. Locke was as well, but Locke's Christianity was bizarre. He was, I would maybe argue that he was an egoist, implicit egoist, but he's commonly called a hedonist. So his Christianity was very constrained by seeking pleasure and whatnot. So he and Berkeley were worlds apart on just about everything. It's really strange. I mean, the only thing that Berkeley and Hume really took from Locke, well, at least Berkeley, was that what we do know comes from the evidence of our senses. We don't have these innate ideas. Hume took a bit more from Locke. Hume he also believed that all of everything we come to know comes through the evidence of our senses. But he held that essentially the things of our experience are really just held together by a sort of, what's the word I'm searching for? I'm sorry. He denied that there's any such thing as induction, that we can have knowledge of the world, that there are any sort of causal laws. So I actually do talk much more about this in my piece. It's a section called Seeds of Skepticism. So there's a more concise answer for you there, I think. Thank you. Oh, I do want to say a little bit about that, though. So Thomas Reid, a Scottish philosopher, he started the Scottish School of Common Sense Realism, adopted Locke's view, but he got rid of Locke's inconsistencies in many ways. So he said that, no, we don't perceive just our ideas, we perceive the world directly. And he was the teacher of Francis Hutcheson, whose students included many of the greats of the Scottish Enlightenment, who helped take Scotland from a Calvinist theocracy that executes heretics to a powerhouse of innovation. Another student of his, what was his name? The president of Princeton, whose students included Aaron Burr and James Madison. His name will come to me. Sorry, David, I know you're next. That was a long-winded answer. I apologize.
He's prioritizing
prioritizing.
Oh, I appreciate that. How's it going,
I think
James?
We have plenty of time though for both. Yeah, so I was just thinking about all of this really, like the empiricists, and I was just curious, like, how do you think their ideas tie into Karl Popper's theory of like falsificationism in science?
I'll plead ignorance on that one. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just not familiar with Karl Popper's theory of
It's
falsification.
basically, well, I'll try to give a brief introduction to it. It's basically
go ahead.
that science isn't about proving things right. It's about saying we can't prove something wrong, essentially. Might be slightly mischaracterizing it.
Science is not about proving things right. It's about proving things aren't wrong. Well, Locke was skeptical that we would ever have a science of induction, so to speak. I didn't get into this in my talk, but he thought that the world essentially was made up of these tiny, imperceptible pieces of matter called corpuscles. And he thought that it was very, very unlikely. So he lived when microscopes were not powerful enough to see these things. And he thought it was extremely unlikely that we're ever going to actually get to a science of corpuscles. So he was pretty pessimistic about us getting to a theory of induction. I guess the connection there is not, if you don't have induction, if you can't prove things right, then what are you left with? Proving things wrong. So off the cuff, I think that's the only connection I can really make between
Okay, so that you think
Popper
there
and
would be
Locke
some
there.
agreements. Okay.
Thanks for your patience.
Sure, John. I heard you, I heard you, and I've heard elsewhere too, this concept of natural rights. And because the word rights is plural, it makes me, I think, there
That's
must be a
unfortunate.
list somewhere of these rights. So I get confused.
Yeah, good question.
wonder if you could
I think
address-
it's just an unfortunate use of the pluralism. Like I said, Locke thought that all our rights derive from one fundamental right, our right to life. So in a sense, you could divvy it up and say that there are property rights and right to self-defense and things like that. But in essence, there's the right to life.
Hey, thank you for your talk. What was the connection between Baruch Spinoza and Locke? Were they? I know they were contemporaries. Did they interact at all, as far as you know?
No. Leibniz, another rationalist, attempted to make contact with Locke. He wrote to Locke. He admired Locke. He questioned Locke on several things. But his English was so bad that Locke could really do nothing but laugh at him, which is really unfortunate. It would have been amazing to have a dialogue between these two thinkers, right? But Leibniz, he was, he actually, I think, appreciated Locke. And Locke appreciated Leibniz's advances in mathematics, but not so much anywhere else. So no, I don't know of any connection between him and Spinoza. Hey, Richard.
Hi, John. Could you comment on Locke's theory of revolution? Because
Yeah.
because
Did I skip that?
The tail end of the treatise says we have a right to revolt if government does not protect individual rights. And I'm reminded because you brought up Hobbes. Hobbes said we do not have a right to revolt
Yeah.
against Leviathan. So, but what I'm most interested in, John, his view of reason that we can be certain, because the whole idea of revolting, you have to have some certainty that you have rights and
Yeah.
can do this to government, how it affected the founders. Thanks, John.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Locke's epistemology in some ways undercuts his politics. Like I said, his view of the law of nature was something that derives from God. Well, also, if you believe that we're incapable of certainty, what does that do? That means if Berkeley comes along and says that the law of nature is this thing that demands blind obedience, and he said further that if you don't agree with me, well, that's because you're raised among immoral customs. The law of nature is this thing. Well, Locke, by his own admission in the essay, unfortunately concedes that it's very unlikely that we can come to certainty on certain things. So, if you're in a debate, Locke would have to concede that, in essence, we can't be certain that we're right about revolting. But he, in the two treatises, essentially says that it's going to come down to enough people being persuaded that their rights are being abused and that they ought to revolt. Does that answer your question?
So, all this baloney going on with national social, what is it, conservative, what is it called? National conservatism. The new, when the conservatives switched over to, against liberalism, and then all the, this crazy thing that's going on in the world. It makes you think when you think about the historical roots of all this. This is all already happened before, right? This is like nothing new, like national conservatism and then the liberals. So it makes me, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, this isn't such a tragedy, because maybe there is something on the other side that, some rationality is going to succeed or gonna.
What's the other side in this case?
In other words, that this kind of, to me, it seems like a kind of a blackness. I mean, they're totally rejecting the traditional liberalism. The liberal history or the liberal foundations of the West. Right? They're going towards this. The conservatives are going towards this paternalistic system, and then of course the liberals are also going towards statism. So to me, it seems like a black thing that's coming up, But so my question is, or my thing is, well, if this is nothing new, so perhaps, in the next few years there will be an evolution where we'll get some more rational people coming forward. I don't know.
That's what we're here for.
I guess that's more of a statement than but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Or
I do. Bring more people to this conference.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I think we have a little bit more time, but I won't be offended if there aren't any.
Okay. What is Locke's point of view about democracy?
Speak a little bit closer to the mic.
What is Locke's point of view about democracy and how society has to construct the concept?
Yeah. So Locke is a bit unclear on this because he says in places that government has limits that derive from our rights. Unfortunately, in other places, he also says that when people come into society, they agree to live by majority vote. So Locke is somewhat of a grab bag. I mean, people who have very, very different views can grab from Locke and quote here and there and pull out pieces. But the essence of Locke's system is quite obvious. It's the system that inspired the American Revolution, right? So these academics, the fact that they can pull on thoughts here and there, I really don't think that that's... obviously, we have to be just in the sense that we have to both appreciate Locke's huge advances in these fields, but we also have to understand that, yeah, he had some pretty bad ideas as well. So that's why I say, in order to secure a future for freedom and flourishing, we have to be able to say clearly and on fully rational grounds what rights are, where they come from, and how we know it. And fortunately, Carl and Craig wrote a great pamphlet on liberty that you can find in the goodie bags that we handed out, and I think that's a really good start if you need some material on the subject. Thanks again, guys.